My Hero Academia has a new hero. Invincible, along with his classmates at UA, have obtained their provisional hero licenses, and now look to make the world a better place. But will Invincible change the events of the MHA story for the better, or will All for One use this new change to his advantage? Well, that's why today we're talking My Hero Academia meets Invincible Part 2. But before we get to anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Alright, getting right into it, My Hero Academia meets Invincible. Now, as I mentioned, Invincible now has obtained his provisional hero license, and everyone else in Class 1A has also obtained their provisional hero licenses. So the next big event that they are all going to be a part of is picking a hero work study. And in my opinion, based on what I said in the first video, I believe that Invincible would realistically choose whatever agency that Deku ended up choosing. They probably would have had a closer friendship than anyone else in the MHA universe. So Invincible will be off to the Night Eye agency along with Midoriya and Lemillion. And that will inevitably bring them into a clash with the Shie Hassaikai. However, this clash is going to be very, very different. And there are a couple reasons for this. First and foremost, I don't believe the entire raid that ended up happening in MHA is going to happen in this universe. And there's a very specific reason why. And that's because Lemillion and Deku, at one point when they're out on patrol, actually run into Overhaul. And they run into Eri. And Deku wants to take her right then and there. He's prepared to fight Overhaul if it means saving Eri. However, Lemillion decides to wait. Lemillion decides that it is not the right time to do so. However, if we were to add Invincible into this scenario, he would 100% be on the side of Deku. In fact, he would probably go even further than Deku. And that's why, in my opinion, at this moment, a battle would ensue. A battle between Invincible, Deku, Lemillion, and Overhaul. All three of them taking on Overhaul in order to save Eri. Now, there are a couple things we have to take into account when we're analyzing this fight. First and foremost, Lemillion and Deku both had altercations with Overhaul. However, very important thing to note. First and foremost, Lemillion was said to have defeated Overhaul. And this isn't my analysis of their battle. This is quite literally Overhaul admitting that he was unable to defeat Lemillion and that Lemillion got the best of him. And Deku, on the other hand, while he wasn't able to defeat Overhaul until Eri started to use her quirk subconsciously, rewinding Midoriya to the point where he could just keep breaking his body, utilizing One for All at 100% for the entire duration of their battle, Midoriya was still doing a decent job keeping up with Overhaul. However, an important thing to note, this wasn't a base form Overhaul. He had merged himself with one of the Shie Hassaikai, so he gained their powers as well. And over the course of their battle, at the beginning, Midoriya was only using 8% of One for All, and it was noted that this wasn't enough. However, as their battle progressed, Midoriya started to utilize 20% of One for All. And this is something that Overhaul himself took note of. He said Midoriya had gotten noticeably faster, and his attacks started to get stronger. However, they were predictable. And Midoriya himself even said that this isn't something he could keep up for long. One for All could only be maintained at 8% by that point. He could amp it up to 20% for the duration of this battle. However, he's in excruciating pain as he's using 20%. No, he's not breaking any bones at this point. However, it is putting a huge stress on his body overall. So this wouldn't be a prolonged battle that Midoriya could sustain 20% of One for All. However, an important thing to note, first and foremost, this would be Lemillion and Deku going against a base Overhaul. And considering the fact that Lemillion was able to theoretically defeat Overhaul in his base form by himself, it does stand to reason that adding Deku, whether it is his 8% or his 20% usage of One for All, would make a substantial difference. However, there's another important thing to note. We would be adding Invincible to this fight. And by this point, this would be a version of Invincible that is as powerful as he was in Season 3. We saw how powerful he had gotten thanks to the training he had done with Cecil. So it does stand to reason that after all this time at UA, after all of these different training sessions that he had gone through, he would have obtained a similar strength that he had in Season 3. And if that's the case, then he has speeds and strength that even rival that of Anissa and rival that of Omni-Man. So if you add Invincible to this battle against Overhaul, I feel like the battle would be relatively quick. Invincible would likely just hit him up into the air to ensure he has nothing to utilize his quirk on and slam him back into the ground, and when he arrives down there, Midoriya and Lemillion are there to launch him back up. And this could essentially become a giant game of pinball between Invincible, Midoriya, and Lemillion, similar to how Midoriya ended up defeating Overhaul in the initial story. However, except in this instance, it wouldn't be Midoriya just hitting Overhaul back and forth to himself. Instead, they would already be in position to land the next blow. This would do even more damage than Overhaul had sustained in the original fight with Midoriya. And a very important thing to to note, that was a version of Overhaul who had merged with members of the Shie Hassaikai to increase his own power. This would be a base version of Overhaul. So with all that being said, I feel like this fight would be over before Midoriya has to stop utilizing 20% of One for All. And since they end up taking down Overhaul without having to do any type of raid, this would result in a lot of people seeing how capable these new heroes are. Because keep in mind, they have provisional hero licenses, which means they are allowed to assist in emergency situations. And I don't know about the rest of you, but rescuing a girl from an abusive father who is literally utilizing her body to make bullets sounds like an emergency to me. And considering the scope of this battle, as long as they don't do a ton of damage within the city, I think it does stand to reason that they would gain a lot of acclaim and a lot of admiration from their fellow heroes and also from the general public. And keep in mind, Lemillion and Deku are incredibly smart, so I feel like they would be able to help keep down collateral damage in this battle. And Invincible would mainly be up in the sky doing damage, ensuring that his insane attacks aren't demolishing buildings and aren't demolishing a bunch of city blocks in the process. So after this point, Overhaul is defeated, Eri ends up being safe, but another important development that happens because of this, Shigaraki doesn't get his hands on the quirk deleting bullets. That is going to come into play in our next major event, and that is the Paranormal Liberation Front. Now, as much as I would love to say that Invincible would be on the front lines taking down Dr. Garaki or helping out at the Gunga Villa, I think it is safe to say, because of the characters that ended up helping out, it would stand to reason that Invincible would likely be in the group with Midoriya, Shoto, and Bakugo, considering the fact that those three are literally the strongest in Class 1A. They clearly were not going for Hero Corps students who are the most powerful. They make it very clear that they only selected Hero Corps students who had quirks that could subdue multiple enemies in a very large group. And considering the fact that Invincible's power set doesn't really allow him to do that, it would stand to reason that he would likely be one of the people, along with Midoriya, Shoto, and Bakugo, to just evacuate. However, things would change over the course of this battle. And as we know, Shigaraki ends up waking up. He demolishes part of a city. And as a result, we know that he is after One for All. And although we could argue whether or not Invincible would know about One for All in this situation, I personally believe that All Might and Midoriya would have shared the secret not only with Bakugo, but also with Invincible, because they would have known and realized the important role that Invincible will likely play in the future of hero society. And because of the connection that Midoriya and Invincible would have formed in part 1 of this video, I feel like it does stand to reason that All Might would have been okay with just Invincible knowing the secret. However, either way, it doesn't really matter. Invincible will end up on the battlefield against Shigaraki, so everything else essentially happens the same way. Shigaraki ends up chasing after Midoriya and Bakugo, and Invincible is either there right at that moment, or he swoops in later. However, either way, the moment that he is going to swoop in is the moment Shigaraki goes after Mr. Aizawa. And this is a very key moment in the battle, because Mr. Aizawa was utilizing his erasure to take away all of Shigaraki's quirks. This was giving them the edge in this fight, and allowing them to actually have a real chance of taking down this great enemy. And although Midoriya was able to get there the first time when Shigaraki did attack Aizawa, the second time he went to attack him, he failed. But a big reason for this was because Shigaraki had a quirk deleter. And although that did lead to Mr. Aizawa having to cut off his leg, it also led to Shigaraki being able to break free from Ryukyu's grip and also break free from Deku's grasp that he had on him at that point. And at that point in time, it was made very clear that Shigaraki had speed that surpassed what Deku could achieve at that moment, because by that point, Deku could only utilize consistently 30% of One for All, and then he could kick it up to 45% at the point of impact. But that means his speed was usually stuck at around 30% usage of One for All. However, since that is the case, if we insert Invincible into this situation, he would definitely be able to get there and save Mr. Aizawa. And although Mr. Aizawa wouldn't be in danger from getting hit by the quirk deleter, he would be in danger from his eyes getting messed up when Shigaraki went to grab them. However, if Invincible is there and swoops in, this wouldn't happen. And this would be incredibly important for a bunch of reasons. However, the most important reason would be that Mr. Aizawa would be able to continue to utilize his erasure, ensuring that Shigaraki isn't able to heal. And this would mean that during the course of this battle, we would be able to have Invincible, Midoriya, Bakugo, and Endeavor, not to mention Gran Torino, all taking on Shigaraki without any of his quirks. So all he has usage of is his absurd strength. And I feel like it does stand to reason that Invincible, by this point in time, because this is a version of Invincible that was able to go up against Conquest, would be able to outmatch Shigaraki in terms of strength. So I feel like over the course of this battle, it would become very apparent that Shigaraki is going to lose. And even when those other Nomu do arrive, they would be battling all of the other pro heroes that are there on the battlefield. battlefield. That's the entire reason that Bakugo and Deku had to enter the battle in the first place. So this backup wouldn't really do anything for Shigaraki, and Shigaraki would end up getting defeated. Now, he wouldn't be killed in this moment. A lot of times in MHA, the heroes don't really kill the villains unless they absolutely have to, and it usually only happens to Nomu. So considering all that, Shigaraki would just be unconscious and he would no longer be able to move. However, it's at this point that Gigantomachia would arrive. He would have all of the League of Villains on his back and they would try to get Shigaraki out of there. And although Invincible is incredibly strong, I think by this point he would be pretty weakened after fighting Shigaraki and likely helping to fight a lot of the Nomu, to the point where he could get pretty badly injured by Gigantomachia. However, very important thing to note, someone else also arrives on the side of the heroes, and that someone else would be Best Jeanist. And his arrival would do so much because not only would it help to restrain Gigantomachia, it would restrain a lot of the League of Villains members that are there at that moment in time. And they'd likely all be restrained before Dabi even reveals the truth about Endeavor and the truth about who he really is. And this would help public sentiment not be shifted so far against all of the heroes. Lemillion would also arrive. He would start to take down all of the Nomu that hadn't been taken down already. Invincible, Lemillion, and Deku would likely work together to take down all the remaining Nomu, and Endeavor and Shoto would likely team up to take down Gigantomachia, which, keep in mind, it only took one punch from Endeavor to fully knock out Gigantomachia, thanks to the other members of Class 1A getting that substance in Gigantomachia's mouth that was essentially a sleeping agent to knock him out. It just had a very delayed effect. So by this point in time, essentially all of the Nomu would be taken down by the combined forces of Bakugo, Midoriya, Invincible, and Lemillion, not to mention a couple other pro heroes that would also be there in that point in time. Gran Torino also wouldn't have suffered the same injury that he did from Shigaraki, and considering the fact that Mr. Aizawa is also there, utilizing his erasure very likely on the remaining Nomu, it would stand to reason that all of these heroes combined would be able to relatively easily take out all the remaining Nomu. And then once this happens, Best Jeanist can truly focus on taking down all of the League of Villains members that are remaining there. Now, this truly only leaves one person left that can save the day for the villain side, and that would be All For One taking over Shigaraki's body. So in this moment, that would happen, and it would likely pierce through Endeavor or Shoto or maybe even Bakugo. However, an important thing to note, in this moment, he would have an exchange of dialogue with not only Midoriya, but also with Invincible, and he would likely try to get Invincible to join his side, and he would promise him power. He would promise him a ton of different things. However, in this moment, Invincible, in my opinion, would absolutely not even listen to a single word that All For One is saying. He is so focused on becoming a hero, that is probably the only thing that he cares about, especially in this moment. And considering they are this close to victory, I feel like it does stand to reason that even if All For One does take over Shigaraki's body, considering all the damage that had been done up to this point, it does stand to reason that Invincible would be able to, with the help of someone like Lemillion, Bakugo, Midoriya, and maybe even Shoto, would be able to take out All For One taking over Shigaraki's body with relative ease. And they probably wouldn't even end up doing much damage to themselves. And considering the fact that someone like Gran Torino and maybe even Endeavor would still be in this fight as well, it does stand to reason that they'd likely end up taking down Shigaraki, Gigantomachia, and all of the League of Villains members in one fell swoop, leading to one of the biggest victories for the heroes. And something that ended up being a very big negative for the heroes would end up being a gigantic victory. They would have taken in thousands of villains, not to mention all of the League of Villains members, not to mention Gigantomachia, not to mention thwarting the plans of All For One. And this would lead to one of the biggest victories that Japan had ever seen for hero society. And because Shigaraki is unable to escape, then that means conversely, he never attacks Tartarus and he never breaks out All For One, leading to All For One truly remaining trapped there. Now, will All For One break out one day? Will he come up with another plan? That would be a topic for another video, but for right now, there would be peace in Japan, thanks to the efforts of the heroes of Japan alongside a lot of the Class 1A Hero Corps students. And this would lead to so much fame and admiration for specifically Shoto, Invincible, Midoriya, and Bakugo. This would propel them on a course to becoming top 10, if not all top 5 heroes in the My Hero Academia universe. And although they can't technically be ranked until they become full-fledged heroes and gain their actual hero licenses, it would stand to reason that as soon as they obtain those licenses, they would probably be ranked in the top 10 just based on everything they did in this battle, putting an end to the villain society as a whole, thwarting All For One and the League of Villains, and ushering in a true era of peace within Japan. However, how long would that peace last? Would All For One just remain in his cell, or would he have another plan up his sleeve? But I'm interested to hear from all of you. How do you think everything would play out? How do you think All For One would respond to his plans essentially blowing up in his face? space? And how do you think Omni-Man would react if he were to return to Earth and see everything that had unfolded? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.